University and your technology chair for NAGAP. And on behalf of the whole NAGAP board and our NAGAP membership, I want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for what looks to be a really content-filled webinar on working with agents. I know a lot of us have struggled with how we move forward with this. Some of you may already be working with agents. If you're like me, we're just starting to get using agents, so we can all benefit from some of the great content that I think Ray and Kirsten will provide for us this afternoon. I just wanted to remind you of a couple of quick things. So for those of you that are NAGAP members, make sure that you vote. We're currently going through our elections for the upcoming board that will turn over in the spring. So make sure you vote by December 14th, so that's by Monday. So make sure you check your email. That we have a really big slate of candidates with some really great candidates this year, so make sure you look through all of that, read through everybody's bios, and make an informed vote for us. We really need your vote for a good board. We also have our upcoming winter PDI. Will be on January 21st and 22nd in Palm Springs, California. There's still some space available. If you'd like to participate in that, just visit our website at nagap.org. And of course, we're coming up on our 29th annual conference in Nashville in April, so we'd love to have you there. We'll have registration open for that very soon. We've been working hard to select presentations for our upcoming conference, and I know Ray and Kirsten will be involved in an international presentation coming up, and perhaps some folks from AIRC as well, so we're really excited for that, so you can continue the conversation that you might be interested in from today's agent webinar. Logistically, I just want to point out that if you haven't been on a webinar with us before, if you want to ask any questions, you'll notice on the right side of your screen in the panel, there is a questions box, and you can ask your questions there. And we will stop periodically throughout the session to ask those questions to the presenters, and also have an opportunity at the end if you want to have any lingering questions that you have or some further discussion. They'd be happy to provide that for you. And of course, we will make the slides available to you, and we are recording this webinar, so that will be available on our NAGAP YouTube channel. So just make sure you go to youtube.com/NAGAP video, and you'll be able to find this and all of our other archived webinars as well up there. So at this point, I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about our two presenters. Start first with Kirsten. Kirsten Feddersen is the Director of Global Outreach at SNHU, Southern New Hampshire University, and is a member of the Board of Directors of the AIRC, which is the American International Recruitment Council. She previously worked in agency strategy for the State University of New York system. She's originally from Denmark, and she served there as an AIRC certified agent and previously worked at Aarhus University. She originally came to the U.S. in the late 90s to study for a brief time at the University of Hawaii and Washington State University. And Dr. Raymond Lutzky serves as the Senior Director of Graduate Enrollment Management and Admissions at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. Dr. Lutzky is the Chair of International Relations for NAGAP, and you're all familiar with NAGAP, of course. Prior to joining NYU, he served as Associate Director of Admission at Pace University in New York and Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute up in Troy. Dr. Lutzky holds a master's degree in public relations from Syracuse University and a PhD in communication and rhetoric from Rensselaer. So he's a pretty smart guy, and both of them are, as you can imagine. So I'm going to turn it over without any further ado to Ray. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the questions box, and we'll ask them as we go along.
Thanks, Marcus. You set the bar way too high for me. I appreciate it. And again, I echo what Marcus had to say. To those of you who are listening, on behalf of NAGAP and our board, sincerely thank you for joining us today. In particular, on behalf of the International Relations Committee of NAGAP, we are working very hard this year to create new resources and educational opportunities for NAGAP membership around issues related to international student recruitment, and we've found that there is tremendous interest around the topic of international agents. We know that there are tremendous passions around this topic. We know that there are significant opinions. There are folks who have great experiences working with agents, and then there are institutions that have not had great experiences working with agents. We hope that over the course of the next year and beyond, the International Relations Committee will be able to provide additional resources to the NAGAP membership to help advise members on how to make decisions related to the use of international agents. And through that, we have entered into a unique partnership with the American International Recruitment Council, AIRC, which is a standard-setting organization, a standards-developing organization. for the use of international agents. We'll be talking more about that later in the webinar, but I wanted to let you know that if you have questions or comments about the work of the International Relations Committee, or would like to share your thoughts about this webinar or anything to do with anything NAGAP may suggest regarding working with international agents, I welcome your feedback as chair of the International Relations Committee, and I can be reached at rlutzky@nyu.edu. My email address is going to be on this presentation and also on the committee page on the NAGAP homepage. So please do not hesitate to share your feedback with me. The International Relations Committee is very interested in hearing from you. But we're also very, very fortunate on this webinar to have Kirsten Feddersen with us, who is a member of the board of AIRC and has significant global experience with international student recruitment. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn things over to Kirsten, let her begin the webinar, and as we go through, we will ask from time to time if there are questions, but we have a lot of content to get through, so we hope to have all those answered. So Kirsten, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you to everyone who decided to attend this webinar. I can see we've got a great group of attendees with us. So as Marcus mentioned to you before, my background is a little bit varied, and I've got a couple of different perspectives on agency recruitment, primarily because I have worked in the US as someone who's managing agency relationships, but prior to that, I was working in Denmark for 6 years for an agency. So when I talk to people about agency recruitment, I usually say I'm still an agent at heart, but I'm sort of gradually moving over to the other side, but hopefully I'll be able to continue as sort of a middleman between the two, or middle woman rather. So before we, oops, sorry, there we go. Before we move into talking about how to work with agents, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. As both Marcus and Ray mentioned earlier, there's a lot of conversations about working with agents. What are they? What should they be doing? What are they doing? How do we best utilize those relationships? And should we be utilizing them at all? So I try to pull this really back to basics, at least initially, just to make sure that we know what these types of organizations look like, and also where do we begin with all of this. So an agent, as many of you will know, is typically a private for-profit company. A typical agent will be located in the market where you're trying to recruit. And I'm saying typically because there's so many different variations of what an agent is. So, but this is sort of the general perception of your average agent. They're located in the market where you're trying to recruit. So for instance, if you're trying to recruit from India, from China, from Vietnam, wherever it might be, most institutions would go to an agent who's based on the ground in that market. Most of our objectives, so as an institution, for most of us, the primary reason for going to an agent is, needless to say, to help us increase international student numbers from a particular market. In most cases, an agent will have an agreement for commission with a host institution. That's not always the case. Again, lots of exceptions. Sometimes agents will be sending students to a particular institution not for commission, but making their profits in other ways. But the typical, when we're talking about agent to institution relationships, we normally refer to the type of relationship where there is an agreement between the two parties. So really, what an agent is and should be is the institution's boots on the ground, because we as institutional representatives can't be in the market all the time. It's someone who has our interest at heart in that market when we can't be there, so in between trips to the market. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of different varieties of agents, and they often vary by market, but also within the markets. A lot of the agents that we work with at SNHU and also at SUNY when I was there are small family-run businesses, and this is really a type of agent that have worked quite well for us. I know there's a lot of institutions who often focus on the larger agencies because they are perceived to have a much broader scope and they can cover the market in a different way and more broadly. But I really want to emphasize that small family-run businesses can work incredibly well, especially because you have a different type of relationship with a small agency where the staff turnover is typically less. There's also a lot of multi-office single market agents. For instance, in India, there's an agent such as Can-Am, or there's Pac Asia, agents who primarily operate in a single market but with multiple offices. In addition to that, there are global agents, multi-country agents, IDP being one of them. Some of you might be familiar with them. IDP is a great example of one of these global agents. They have more than 80 different offices in over 35 countries, so they really are covering a large part of the markets that we all travel to. There's also smaller multi-country agents that cover maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different countries with multiple offices in all of them. In addition to that, there are a number of single office agents or smaller agents who primarily work with sub-agents, or who recruit locally in their own markets but also recruit from other markets through a network of sub-agents. Before I move forward, I just want to give a definition for the term sub-agent, because I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with it. A sub-agent is essentially an agent who is entering an agreement with another agent to channel their applications to a specific institution. For instance, when I was working at SUNY System Administration, we would only make agreements directly with AIRC certified agents. So agents that had gone through the certification process offered by the American International Recruitment Council. This meant that there were a number of agents who were interested in working with us who didn't have that opportunity because they didn't have the certification, perhaps they hadn't been in business long enough, or they didn't have the resources to pay for the certification. So they will enter into an agreement with one of our existing agents, and ultimately the 2 agents will typically share the commission. So that's a sub-agent. There are agents who primarily operate on a sub-agent basis where they really don't have much contact with the student directly, but they are recruiting through a network of agents around the world. Another form of agent is an alumni working exclusively with one institution. So for instance, Southern New Hampshire University, we've got alumni around the world who we've entered into an agreement with on a commission basis. So they, even though they are alumni of the institution, they in essence function as an agent for us. On top of that, there are other service providers with an agent component. For instance, in some countries, including Latin America, there are a number of travel agencies who have then later on branched out and have taken on the agent component. There are ELS is an example of an organization who does that as well. They're originally an English language provider, but they then have an agency in India as well. So there's really a lot of different models for what can considered to be an agent, but really it's when there is an agreement for recruitment and there's a compensation to the outside party. So the question is, what should an agent do for the institution? First and foremost, the function of an agent in a particular market is to market that institution to any student who might be interested in studying overseas. As I said before, a lot of times for most of us, we're not able to be in the market. Some of us have limited travel budgets. Some of us have many markets to cover. And while it is still important to nurse that relationship with the agent, we just can't be everywhere at the same time. So that's the function of your agent. They need to be in the market to market your institution to the prospective students. And once that student turns into an actual prospect where they're actively looking and perhaps talking to the agent about what their options are, the agent will be advising the students about the best possibilities or the best options for their profile and their wishes, and also vetting prospective students for the institution to make sure that the student is actually qualified. That's a big part of how we use our agents at SNHU, because we rarely receive unqualified applications from our agents. If we do, that's something we address with them, because really that should be one of the basic functions of an agent. On top of that, once we've received the application, and also leading up to that point, the function of the agent is really to manage the application process for the student. Rather than each of these students communicating with us as an institution directly, everything goes through the agent. So they need to verify that the application that the documents are originals, and also they're typically sending the application and the related documents to us, and we would also be sending the I-20 to them. So that's how we work with it. I know institutions do this differently, but ideally the agent would be your central point of contact for the application from that student. Their role is also to communicate with the student. In many cases, we will not have communicated with the student until the point where the student is actually about to arrive, because the agent should be able to manage that process. And also, if there are any problems coming up in that communication, for instance, there's an issue with the student's transcript or their English language proficiency documents or whatever it might be, we communicate with the agent because the student might not necessarily understand what we're looking for. In addition to that, there are a number of other things an agent can do for you in the market. For institutions who don't have a very strong brand in a market, the agent can help you with that. And for SNHU, we have, in some markets, we have a very good grasp, and we have a brand name, so to speak. In other markets, we're just moving in, and in those cases, it's very important for us to have good partners on the ground. For instance, going into a new market, we would rarely go in and attend a fair without having anyone on the ground to be able to follow up and kind of continue the work that we've started. So branding is an important piece of why we work with agents, at least. Also, an agent should be able to provide you with market intelligence about this particular market. We all see the same data. We see the open doors data, other sources, which are incredibly important for getting an overview. But at the same time, there might be things going on locally in the market that we don't know about unless there's someone there who understands that this information is relevant for us. In addition to that, an agent should be able to brief you about recruitment opportunities. For instance, there might be fairs that are offered that could be relevant, where the agent can offer their support during the fair. For instance, we work with a number of good agents in Turkey, and one of them is always present with us at one of the recruitment fairs we attend, because that saves me the effort of having to follow up with each one of those students individually. And given how much time that could potentially take, and that I have an agent who's quite capable and can do that in the local language, I'm happy to pay the commission to that agent for doing the work that I'm saving myself from doing, essentially, or that they're saving me from doing. Another thing that agents will sometimes be able to do is to connect you with institutions in the market, particularly if you're looking for articulation agreements. In some markets, you might be perfectly capable of doing that on your own, but in others, it could be really hard. It can be really hard to navigate. China comes to mind in that respect. We have worked closely with an agent in China for a number of years, and they've really helped us with many of these institutional relationships. On top of that, an agent is a great way of helping you figure out what you should be doing during a visit to a market. If you don't want to attend one of the major events, such as some of the major fairs that are being organized not by agents but by other providers, there's always the opportunity to attend the agent's own fairs, which a lot of agents actually host. They might be able to organize high school visits for you, alumni events, seminars, one-on-one meetings with students. So my experience has been, and this is also from my own past as an agent, that agents will often be more than happy for you to show an interest in engaging with them for something other than just sending or just the admissions piece of your relationship. So that's really a great way for you to engage with the agent. So what does a good agent do? And as Ray mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different experiences out there with working with agents, and needless to say, not all agents are good. The landscape of agency recruitment is incredibly varied, and there are great agents and there are agents that are absolutely far from great. And fortunately, what we often see is that those agents don't tend to stay in business for too long. But when they're midstream and they're still operating, it can be hard to sometimes tell the good ones from the bad ones. What a good agent should do for you is to submit complete and qualified applications. So not submit applications that have missing documents, and also not from students who don't meet your admissions requirements. Ideally, you have an agent who's applications often convert to enrollment. I know that's sometimes an issue. We've worked with agents who converted about 5 to 10%, which really doesn't benefit us all that much because our admissions team end up spending a lot of time on something that ultimately doesn't yield a result. It's more common in some markets than others, and that needs to be taken into consideration before you have a conversation with the agent about it, because there are markets where students simply send a higher number of applications. For instance, in China, students will typically send somewhere from 10 to 15 applications, and then there are markets like Denmark where our students would typically just send one. So our conversion rates as an agent were close to, were between 90 and 100%. So the market does factor into that as well, but high conversion rates are an important part of a successful relationship with an agent. Make sure that the students are satisfied. That's really an important piece of it. And again, that is ensured by the agent really understanding what the qualifications and the needs and the wishes of the student are. If you have an agent who's consistently pushing students to places where they end up not staying, if you have a lot of students transferring out and those students are coming in from a particular agent, as a former agent, I understand that the relationship or the responsibility cannot always be put on the agent, but if it's a trend and it keeps happening, it most likely has something to do with expectation management, and then that needs to be addressed. High retention rates, that's what I just mentioned in my previous point. Again, if students are moving on quickly, there's a mismatch there. And lastly, I'm not opposed to agent fees in any way, because in some markets they are important and an expected part of the package that students are getting from an agent. So there are markets where agents or where students are more than happy to buy additional services from the agent, so to speak, but what we do look for in an agent is just to make sure that they're transparent and fair. The students need to get what they're paying for, and the agent needs to be transparent about what that package looks like. In terms of the agent's relationship with an institution, what they need to do is also understand the institution's product and brand. I've been in situations with agents where I have a desire to train them. I have multiple conversations with them about things that are important about our institution, but it's just not retained. And then we have training sessions with other agents who still 2 years later remember everything I told them. So it is important that the agent is also interested in engaging in this with you. We always talk about training, and Ray and I both just came back from the AIRC conference in Miami, where someone made the point that when we give these presentations, we always talk about things in an idealized way, and it's very true. Resources for training are limited for a lot of us, and we don't do as much as we would like to. But when the agent when the agent is willing to reach out for help, and you have a conversation with them, or whatever resources you can put into that training, it is important that they are receptive to it. A good agent will also help the institution really understand the market and the student demand. So their agents, as I mentioned earlier, are really your opportunity as an institution to learn about that market from someone who's on the ground. Agents do this to varying degrees. Sometimes it's a matter of us really asking the question as well. But the most fruitful relationships we've had have been the ones where we felt like we really had someone on the ground who understood us and the market, and not just someone who's sending us applications. Someone who provides relevant marketing opportunities, like some of the opportunities I talked about before, including fairs, advertising opportunities, whatever else it might be. And also someone who, like you, focuses on a long-term strategy. The best relationships with agents are really just that. They are relationships. So it needs to be, you need to feel comfortable with your agent and make sure that they have your best interests at heart. So basically, someone who you consider to be a trusted representative of your institution, because in that market, they are going to be the face of your institution when you're not there. So what should an agent not do? They should not be unresponsive, and they should not be unreceptive to training. Responsiveness is something that the agents always talk about when they're talking about their relationship with institutions, and I completely agree. We need to be responsive to our agents, but it's a two-way street. So if you have an agent who's unresponsive, that's a warning sign right there. They need to represent your university accurately in the market, and this is the big sort of deal breaker for us. An agent should never knowingly submit false student documentation. We had an agent recently who most likely didn't know that the documentation we received was false, but when we confronted him with it, he said, "Oh well, that's too bad, but can you still admit the student?" And that to us also sends a signal that this agent really doesn't get what this situation looks like from our end. So he's been put on probation. And agents should never make guarantees of admission or scholarships to a student, because that's not their it's not their prerogative to guarantee anything to the student. That's always up to the university, unless there is a specific agreement about that for that particular agent. They should never guide students in a specific direction for personal gain, and I know this has been one of the hot topics in terms of commission, where some institutions were, and some colleagues in the industry were worried about agents pushing students towards a specific institution for higher commission rates. I want to say, though, as a former agent, if you do that as an agent, you're not going to be in business for very long, because students are very savvy. They talk to each other, as do all of us. And so that's a very short-term business strategy if that's how you do things. And lastly, they should never be deceptive or unclear about student fees. So those are just a few of the do's and don'ts. Before I move on to the next section, which Ray will take, are there any questions so far?
Yeah, there actually are a series of questions here, Kirsten, and you may be getting to later on, so feel free to delay them. But
sure.
First question is, can an agent represent more than one school?
Oh, absolutely, and most agents do. A typical, I don't even know if there is a typical amount, but most agents will represent at least 20 schools, I would say. And then you've got agents who represent more than 100 schools. I think it's all about finding that sweet spot. It really depends on the market, but unless it's someone who has, for instance, an alum who graduated from a particular institution, most agents will represent more than one school.
Okay. And do alums have to meet AIRC certification to become agents for your school?
For our school, or for any school?
For any school. I suppose it's a broad question.
I mean, agents or any agent doesn't really have to meet AIRC certification. It is a voluntary certification, but for our school, we don't require it from them. You are in a position to create an agreement directly with that student, with that alum. My main piece of advice would just be to make sure that you have a solid agreement. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later, what should be in an agreement, but it is important when you're working with agents in general to have an agreement that really covers your basis, because just as an example, today I had one of my agents who was on an old agreement that we issued a couple of years ago where it doesn't specify that we won't pay commission for U.S. citizens. But most of us in the field here in the U.S. know that we can't do that as an institution, but it's not specified in the agreement. So now we have to figure out some way to resolve that. So make sure that you have a solid agency agreement, and once that's in place, there shouldn't be anything preventing you from making an agreement directly with an alum as an agent.
Okay, and here's a follow-up question from the previous question.
Mm-hmm.
If agents represent more than one school, how do they equally advise students, and could they have conflicting programs?
Oh, that's a very good question, and also one that will probably take longer to respond to than the amount of time that we have here. It is a very good question, and I think that's one of the questions that's often asked when considering whether to work with agents. It really is about working with the student and figuring out what they're looking for. What are they qualified for? Where do they want to go? What type of programs are they looking for? If the student feels like they've been given a range of options and they choose the one that fit them, then your agent is doing a good job. I mean, we understand at Southern New Hampshire University that we're not competitive with all programs. We're great for business programs and for our graduate MBA, our MBA program, for instance. And then there are other programs where we understand if they go to a school in Boston, for instance, or in Maine or wherever it is, because that institution might have a strength that suits that student better. So really a good agent will be able to, first and foremost, have the student's interests at heart, which makes it a little bit challenging for the institutions. But that is the agent's job, to work with the student, but also for that agent to be able to explain to them what the strengths of your institution are, which is why I'm partial to agents who work with fewer institutions, but also agents who, if they're working with a lot of institutions, have a solid core of advisors. So it's a great question, and it's quite complex. I hope that at least answers it somewhat.
Okay, and we have a whole flood of questions, but I'm gonna just filter out a couple here, and then we can leave the others because you may cover them. But
Okay.
So is there a list maintained by AIRC of agents to avoid, or how is it so that colleges can navigate those agents who have likely been tested before?
Who have been tested?
Well, who agents that where institutions have had experience with. I think the question is getting to is there kind of a blacklist of agents that we should avoid?
Oh, that's a good question. There's not a blacklist from AIRC's list. There is a positive list, though. We have a list of agents who are certified, so that might be worth looking into if you're looking to work with particular agents. I think in terms of figuring out if you're already working with agents, I would ask around, or if you're looking to go into a particular market, use your network of peers. Again, I am here, as I mentioned earlier, I'm also here as an AIRC board member, and this is one of the things that really is beneficial about going to the AIRC conferences, is that it's specifically about agency recruitment. So any conversations to be had about potential agents to avoid or contract with, that would be a great forum to have it. But as for a blacklist, I don't know that there is one out there.
Okay, and this will be the last question. I think this is something that will probably weave through the rest of your session, but how many agents do your universities, and I believe they're referring to both SNHU and NYU, how many do you have at present, and from which countries?
Oh, that's a good question. For us, we just recently reduced that list, actually. I started working with SNHU a little over a year ago, and when I came in, we had not necessarily been that good at maintaining our portfolio in the past. So internally, we had some contracts that hadn't been maintained, some that were not productive. We came from 300, and now we're down to about 100, which is more than we would most likely prefer if we had started from scratch. But it works with a 100 agent. We're not looking to really grow that portfolio more than that. It's also very important for us to be able to maintain those agents, and that's one of the reasons we don't want to expand the portfolio, because we want to be able to train all of them and communicate with them frequently.
Great. So that's it for now.
And I'll just jump in to answer that question. That currently the NYU Tandon School of Engineering does not work with any agents. We certainly receive applications that are sent to us by agents on behalf of students, but at this time my school has no formal relationship with any agents. We had it in the past, but we have ended those at the direction of our dean. But let me pick up here, and I think I can continue on for the next slide about why students work with agents, because many students do, whether institutions decide to or not. And it really does provide students with a resource that in some cases is simply not available in their home market, an overview of suitable higher education options, an understanding of how to navigate the U.S. education market, and in particular in countries where there is a growing but perhaps smaller number of international students coming to the U.S. You know, for example, Latin America, South America, which is the second largest sending continent of international students, many countries are still developing a tradition of sending students to the U.S. So sometimes agents can provide a vital role of coaching those students through the processes to help us get them to where they need to be in terms of a completed application. The visa process is also very difficult for students to navigate, and their families as well. And while some agents focus more than perhaps we would like on the acquisition of a student visa, certainly guidance in navigating that process is invaluable to the student. Understanding the scholarships and expenses is a challenge even for domestic students, and I think that that is another reason why students will elect to work with an agent who understands not only the expenses that are articulated by an institution, but perhaps some of the costs that may not be as apparent, for example, travel expenses. I also want to be very clear here that understanding scholarships means understanding what scholarships are for, not securing scholarships. It's not advisable that agents are speaking to students about that they will guarantee them a scholarship or can get them a scholarship or anything like that, but certainly to understand what scholarships are for and perhaps any requirements on those scholarships. Finding housing can be a challenge for some institutions, and agents can not only help students with resources to locate housing, but also connect them with students who have successfully entered the United States and attend institutions and worked with that agent and perhaps serve as a network for an incoming international student. And then finally, in many markets that have strong agent elements, the ability to work in the United States either as a temporary employee or in a longer term situation is of paramount concern to these students, and even that can be confusing in many of these markets. So the agents can provide a vital role there as well. Keeping in mind that some of you may be thinking, well, what is all of this and why is this really necessary? It doesn't seem necessary if students can do this without agents. But to keep in mind, I know we're talking about graduate students, but there's very little guidance. There are no high school counselors in a lot of these countries, and these agents are really one of the only ways that prospective students are receiving that extra sort of guidance. There are a lot of circumstances where the student may be very strong in English, but their parents or their family members are not. And understanding what that student is going to go through is very important to that family member, and it is very helpful and reassuring to them to have an agent who speaks their native language help them become comfortable with many decisions that will be made. Our application processes are difficult by design. Grad school is not easy. If it was easy, everybody would do it. And that application process sometimes requires the help of someone local, someone who will sit with the student, someone who will help them really understand what they're being asked to do and what to say in terms of selecting a major or in terms of applying for special programs. These students are making a significant investment of their time, their talent, and their treasure to come to our institutions. And that does give folks pause. I mean, like any large purchase, anyone who's going to spend a lot of money on something that puts them in a place they aspire to be, sometimes they need a little hand-holding, and they need a little guidance, and they need a little reassurance, and that's part of this too. I'll go back one more slide. I'm sorry, the last point on the last slide was that also the local language piece. Thanks, Kirsten. The local language piece cannot be overestimated. Certainly, most of our institutions really only offer education in one language, but language can be confusing and it can be tricky. And even students who score very highly on an IELTS or a TOEFL may need additional help in understanding specific instructions, and the agents can do that. So how do you start this process? How do you begin to work with agents? Well, first of all, you have to understand what the institution really wants. What is the vision for international student affairs or international programs on your campus? What sort of internal support mechanisms are there, and not just in terms of getting a student visa or working with CVIS, but things ranging from housing to mental health. What is the environment these students will be entering? What are the resources available to you and your team, or if you're a sole practitioner, available to you? Do you have the budget to work with these agents? Do you have the staff to manage these agents? This is not a set it and forget it kind of thing, folks. You really do need to spend time with your agents, getting to know them, helping train them, checking to make sure expectations are being met, and Kirsten alluded to that. Do you have the programs that you need that would be appealing to students in these markets? It's all well and good if you have a very strong program that's been around for a long time and it's quite prestigious, but if it's not the kind of program that will attract international students. And there's a lot of open data out there about the kinds of programs that are most attractive to international students in different markets. You may not be as successful even when you're working with an agent. Do you have the capacity? Many considerations for international students include that you want to be able to offer them housing, that you want to be able to offer them special programming, sometimes English language programming, and do you have the capacity in your facilities, in your classrooms, in your campus to accommodate that? Where are you in the international landscape? Some institutions enjoy a very favorable, very robust international brand, and some have some work to do, and some of us even have brands that get confused with other schools. So understanding what your international brand is, how you want to be recognized, and how you articulate that to international markets via agents is important when looking at how to work with agents. And finally, competition. We know that within the U.S. we have significant competition for students among NAGAP members. This continues out into the rest of the world, and there are certain markets that are quite saturated with graduate enrollment managers looking to recruit the best international students for their school. So it's important to understand that competitive landscape. The researching of trends, you want to know what's going on in the field. You want to have a sense of what's happening. If you're going to start working with an agent, you don't want to go into this blind. You want to read up. You want to make some preparation. You want to be able to pitch this to your leadership and get their buy-in. You want to really have all the right people on the bus. Where can you get information like this? Where can you find resources? Well, I'll just add that NAGAP will be developing resources hopefully soon for all of our membership to use for these purposes. But also you have peers, you have colleagues at conversations at conferences and informally from time to time. And then also we'll be talking a little bit more in a moment about the AIRC network and how powerful it is and what resources they provide. But certainly that's another way to research trends in agent use. Looking at international student mobility, I mean, open doors, research, white papers that are put out by a variety of nonprofit organizations. These are very valuable places to go for information. And keep in mind also that agents use these resources to plan their business as well, to know where students are going to be coming from and where they want to go. What locations in the U.S. Are they most interested in? Where within those regions, not just abroad, but within the U.S., are they looking? And then how in demand are your programs? This is a gut check. This is a really important thing to consider. While you may have the best MS in liberal ethics or what have you in the country, is that going to attract top students from the markets you're looking at? Is that the kind of degree that they're going to be coming here, spending a lot of money, going through all that angst, and looking for? Because you could assign an agent to recruit for that program for you, but if it's not the right fit in that country, that agent's going to have a very difficult time meeting your requests. So how do you find prospective agents? If you wanted to go about finding good agents, where would you go? First, we say it over and over again, but AIRC is really the only organization currently in the country that does vet and certify agents globally, and it's an extensive process that costs a fair amount of time and money on the part of the agent to get done, and there's a recertification process as well. There are also lots of matchmaking providers. An example is ICF, who I believe right now is actually having their conference in South Florida specifically for this purpose, to match institutions and agents based on interests, based on expertise, and based on markets. Asking peers and your own network is always a good idea. I think that someone asked earlier about blacklists. While I think certainly that could happen in the future, I don't know that that's in the plans for AIRC, but your colleagues would know much better, those who work with agents, which agents they feel you shouldn't work with. I think when you ask a colleague, they're usually the first thing they'll recommend to you is the agents they advise you to not work with, and then move on to the ones that they may have had good experiences with. Of course, NAFSA and other conferences are a tremendous resource for finding out what others think about agents and meeting new ones. And I would also advise, for those who have the resources, one of the most valuable things you can do when considering an agent is to visit that market and to go there, see them, go to their office and see what it looks like. You can learn a lot in the first 10 minutes of visiting an agent's office, what kind of agent they are, what kind of business they do, how happy their employees are, how easy it is to find their office, and know a great deal. And finally, you always have your students to ask. I think you'll always attract the kind of students that you have. So if you start with the international students that you have and ask them candidly to share with you their experiences of working with agents, you may find that some that you had no idea had worked with agents did in fact work with good agents who helped them find your institution and enroll, and that could be the beginning of a wonderful relationship. When you go through the process of selecting agents, there are a lot of things to think about. You need to ask some good questions. You want to ask them if they work with comparable institutions, and in particular within your country. Many of the agents we've discussed are working with schools all over the world. They're working with Australian institutions. They're working with institutions in other parts of the world. Have they worked with an institution like yours, and specifically, have they worked with an institution like yours within the United States? What is the typical profile of a student they work with? Is it a student who is going through a formal test prep program with them? Is it a student who comes from a very affluent background? Is it a lot of students who are coming from a particular school? What sort of communication plans do they have in place? How do they communicate to their students that they serve things about services, about deadlines, about tips and tricks? How do they educate the students they work with? How do they communicate with those students and get them to do what they're supposed to? And then really most importantly, what do they say when they recruit? How does an agent recruit? What do they do? Where do they go? How are they finding this pipeline of students that they're bringing to you? Because that can be one of the most important parts of what an agent is doing. If they're recruiting in ways that you would find spurious or you would prefer them not to, maybe that's not the best kind of agent relationship for you. Again, meeting in person is key. AIRC and ICEF are two meetings we've already mentioned where you can meet agents and get to know them. NAFSA is another one. And then finally, you can always ask an agent for references. All agents should be able to provide you with some references of individuals or institutions they've worked with who can say nice things about them, like asking for reference letters for an application. These should be nice people who will say nice things. Now, you can also ask your colleagues and try and do some off-list reference checking, if you will, but certainly you should ask the agent for the folks they would like you to speak with. And after all of that, I think we're starting to run out of time. So I think at this point, I'll just turn it over to Kirsten so we can get through and maybe get to questions at the end, unless you want to take questions now, Kirsten.
I think we'll proceed from here. But Ray, I have to say, I just realized I did the wrong master's degree. I should have done the MS in liberal ethics. I think that sounds pretty interesting. So Ray just touched on a key point there in the last slide, which was the reference checks, and we do check references quite thoroughly from all of our agents. When it's AIRC certified agents, we don't ask for reference checks because AIRC checks those references quite thoroughly. But that is an excellent way of figuring out how an agent is perceived by other institutions in the U.S. So before you move into agency recruitment, it's important to also reflect on if you're ready to provide what the agent will expect from you, because a good agent will have expectations. The most important thing, and I'm saying this as an institutional representative, but also as a former agent, communication, communication, communication. This comes back to the question that was asked before about how an agent distinguishes you as an institution from other competitive competing institutions. And the most important thing you can do in your relationship with the agent is make sure that they have what they need from you, because the reality is if you're a good partner, you give them the information they need, you communicate with them often, and that relationship works, you're much more likely of getting a student from that agent. Because when we, and I'm saying we because of my previous roles, but when we as agents are talking to a student about their options, the reality is we're much more likely to send that student in the direction of an institution where we know they will have an answer to their application within a couple of weeks. We know that there's going to be somebody there to respond to their questions. The institution is someone who's been in the market, they've been at the fairs, maybe the student had a conversation with them. So the stronger that relationship is and the more you work as an institution to stay on the agent's radar, the better your chances are of getting some of the students in the market who are looking for opportunities like the ones that you're offering. For the agent, it's very important for them to have updated information about admissions requirements. And this sounds like It sounds almost like something that should be obvious to anybody, but the reality is often it's not something that agents will have, because institutions will change their admissions policies internally and then forget to tell their agents. The reality is that the agents cannot advise students correctly about admissions requirements and the application procedure if they don't have correct information. It's just as simple as that. So it's very important to keep your agents in the loop, because otherwise it also puts them in a bad position with their clients if it turns out that they didn't know what they were talking about. They need to have updated contact information for someone at your institution, and ideally one point of contact. I know it's not always possible to do that. In our case, each agent has one admissions person. So they have me as the relationship manager and one person for commission. We'd like to give them just one person, but it's just not possible. But the fewer, the better. Establish a pattern with the agent of prompt responses. Make sure that you're responsive. It really is devastating for an agent, especially if it's an agent or a student who's sent multiple applications. The first institution to get back to them is most likely going to have significantly higher chances of converting that student to an enrollment. I know we're short on time, but I'll just give a quick example, which is my own time that I spent in the U.S. some years ago, where I applied to 6 institutions for a short-term stay, and I had my heart set on California. So I applied to 5 schools in California, and I thought, well, hey, I'll throw in a wild card and apply to University of Hawaii. And this was back in '99, before anything was submitted through the internet. By the time I heard back from the first California institution, I had already bought my tickets to Hawaii, and Hawaii was really my 6th priority when I started. They got back to me within 3 weeks, land mail from Hawaii to Denmark, or airmail, I guess it would be. But they were responsive, and within 2 weeks after I got that, I had already bought my tickets. So it does make a difference that you're responsive. As much as you can, try to ensure a short turnaround time on applications. Again, you don't know who you're up against or how many other institutions that student has applied to. And lastly, and this is a plea on behalf of agents worldwide, please make sure that you process commission payments in a timely manner, because by the time it comes to pay commission to the agent, they will sometimes already have worked with the student for about a year. So they're really getting paid quite late in the process. So make sure that you honor your end of that agreement. So again, we've already covered some of this, but communication with the agent. I know it's challenging because we're often on different continents, but whenever you have a chance to go to the market and communicate with that agent in person, please make use of that opportunity. Training webinars are an easy and very inexpensive way of communicating with your agents and making sure they have the information they need. For those of you who know Prezi, it's basically a different version of PowerPoint, but it's hosted in cyberspace, basically. So if you provide an agency presentation and you give the link to the agent at any time, even after you update it, they can go in and see the most recent version. So we use that for our agency trainings. If it's possible for you to have some kind of online presence designated for your agents, like a Dropbox or a SharePoint or a specific section of your website, that's very helpful as well. Send out an agent newsletter from time to time. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. We use MailChimp, which is a great tool. We can track who's opened our presentations, our newsletters, and so if an agent says, oh, I never got your newsletter, I can in fact go in and say, yes, you did, because I saw that you opened it. And I do that from time to time. We also, whenever possible, make sure that you participate in their marketing initiatives. This is a great way for you to support agents who really contribute in a great way to your enrollment goals. And lastly, again, responsiveness. It is really important. Financial models. There's a number of different models for working with students, working with agents. Most of them are based on a commission structure, where you will either be paying a flat fee to the agent or a percentage of the tuition fee. You can choose to only pay commission for enrollments, or you can also build a retention component into there where you say, well, we'll pay you an initial commission for the first year of enrollment, but if the student stays through his or her second year, we're going to pay you a bonus. Some agents will work with an annual marketing fee. This is a model that some institutions have made use of if they weren't comfortable paying commission. And some agents, particularly in Northern Europe, will charge an annual marketing fee, but also a commission, because those are some very expensive markets to operate in. So if you are working with agents, it can be challenging to have just kind of a one-size-fits-all model across the board, because there are different expectations in different markets. So make sure that you account for that. And before I hand it back to Ray, some of the elements that you should be including in an agreement that you make with an agent is, first and foremost, the scope and the duration of the agreement. Obviously, how long does it last for? What does it cover? What are the obligations of both parties? One of the things that we've done in our agreement at SNHU is that we refer to AIRC standards, and we ask anyone who signs the agreement to please honor those certification standards. Certification standards are the same standards that any certified AIRC agent will be held up against, and they're available on the AIRC website. So even though you also work with agents who are not AIRC certified, you're still in a position to put that into your agreement and say, well, we still expect you to follow those standards. Remember to include what the commission percentages, obviously. I'm sure the agents will let you know if you forgot to include that. Marketing guidelines, can they use your logo, your materials, so on and so forth? How is commission paid out? What are the conditions for the agreements? And also make sure that you include termination options. This is very important. We went from 5 years ago operating on a one-page agreement to now having a 13-page agreement. Now, I'm not in favor of the long agreements, especially having been on the other end of this, but as an institution, it is a really helpful way for us to cover our bases when we go into new relationships. So with that, I will hand it back to Ray, who will talk a little bit about some of his experiences in working with agents.
Sure, thanks, Kirsten. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go pretty quickly through these slides because there's some great information for you about AIRC following them. But just to give you a sense of, I have worked with agents before at NYU Tandon, and what did I find that was useful? I found some really trusted advisors, folks who knew the families and their communities, who had relationships that led to cost savings, things like hosting events and getting deals on spaces and being able to send materials out and having them received in a more timely fashion. I received significant training from my agents, learning about markets, what to do, what not to do, what the concerns of the students were, really the boots on the ground kind of information that, as someone who was new to certain markets, the agents were very easy to work with and helped get me up to speed quite quickly. And while the university is a wonderful thing in terms of rankings and credibility, some of these agents have worked in their communities for years and years and have earned the respect and trust of the families that work with them. And what they say sometimes carries more weight than what a university says. So they do have credibility. What was I challenged by? Talking about liberal ethics. There are some folks that they don't actually see a problem with what they're doing, but if you looked at it, you would say that's a problem. Now, AIRC does a lot to vet the ethics around agents, but for example, a professor who runs an agency and actually gets his students to pay him a commission to send their applications to your school, not exactly the most ethical situation. Sub-agents are always a hot topic. I think AIRC is continuing to deal with sub-agents and how agents deal with other agents who are representing your school that you may never have met. It creates a significant challenge. Some schools prefer to not have their agents work with sub-agents, but AIRC has come up with some techniques for managing sub-agents. I've also learned that some agents are politically connected, and if you engage in a relationship with them, you enjoy intangible benefits, and if you want to terminate that relationship, you enjoy intangible problems. A double-edged sword, if you will. That unfortunately at some institutions leadership has a very negative view of agents, and that is sometimes from experience, sometimes from just chatting with colleagues, and we have some things to work through at certain institutions. If you would like to work with agents, you may have to encounter leadership who really would rather you didn't, and don't understand that there are resources out there to help you make better decisions. And finally, the claims that agents make need to be watched. Agents who claim that they can get admission, as Kirsten said, need to be reprimanded. I hate and love surprises. I was surprised to learn that some of my agents were truly wonderful partners, really great people. I was also surprised to learn that at some of my agencies, as soon as I told them I was no longer going to pay a commission, I wouldn't receive any more applications, that they would not refer their students to me unless I was a commission-paying client. Some of the best agencies I've worked with are also those that offer test prep for things like GRE, GMAT, TOEFL, IELTS, what have you. Some countries, it's simply the way of things. Some countries, getting international students means those students are going to work with agents, meaning whether you have an agreement with agents or not, you are working with agents because they're the ones preparing and sending application materials. And finally, you know, the agents are sending students abroad, and that's an export business. There are a lot of import-export businesses out there in other countries, and some of them have agencies embedded in them. I remember visiting an agent at one point that was one of the first I got rid of, that not only were they exporting students, they were exporting rugs, clothes, those kinds of things, and I'm not kidding. And it was sort of incongruous that there was an agency embedded in sort of this textile export group. Finally, what I learned, the characteristics of the very best agencies that I worked with personally, they knew their students by name, and they were, and I said grandfatherly and grandmotherly here, but it was really sort of that way. It's sort of a, you know, I'm gonna tough love, tell you that you should be studying, and if you're not studying, I'm gonna tell you to, you know, stop playing video games and study. They're actively involved in the success of their students academically. They understand what the students need to do, and they set realistic expectations for those students. That they're adaptable, that when I say I can't have any more students who want this, or I'd rather have students that do this, or you have to stop telling students that they can do this, the agent needs to be responsive, and the best ones were. I also learned, and I'll just put this in as my personal experience, that the best agencies I worked with were owned and operated by women. They were the more ethical, more organized, and more responsive agencies. That was my personal experience. That isn't necessarily a rule of thumb, but it was interesting for me to point out. And the best agencies I worked with by far had a long view of working with me and my institution, in that the day-to-day or the semester-to-semester wranglings were immaterial to having a long, positive working relationship that would extend beyond the term. So with all that, we're really out of time, but I do want to give Kirsten time to talk about AIRC and the resources they can provide NAGAP members.
All right, and thank you, Ray. And remember that these slides will be shared afterwards, so I'm just going to walk through this very quickly. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a board member of the American International Recruitment Council. Southern New Hampshire University is a member of the organization, and also I used to work for an agency that had been certified by the American International Recruitment Council. So AIRC is an organization that was founded in 2008 by senior members of the international higher education community. Incidentally, a lot of them seem to spring out of the University of Cincinnati, so we now call it the Ohio Mafia. But we've since had many more people join the community, and the vision and mission, in short, of AIRC is to set standards for ethical recruitment of international students. It's recruitment as a whole, international student recruitment, but agency recruitment is a key component of that. There are 4 types of membership of AIRC. There are institutional members, so SNHU being one of them. There are certified agencies, there are pathway members, and there are affiliate institutional members. Now the 2 top groups are what I'm just going to talk about briefly. The AIRC certification process, and I speak from experience because I was one of the 2 people who managed it on the agency side. It is a rigorous certification process that takes a very long time to prepare for, and I will tell you there was a lot of swearing going on in that process, but ultimately it was great for us as an agency to have gone through it, because it really makes you look at your own organization to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row. There is a certification committee within AIRC who will then manage that entire process, and essentially what the agency has to live up to and honor and understand are the AIRC certification standards. As I mentioned earlier, these are available on the AIRC website. The agent incurs the cost of the certification, which is it's not cheap, I will tell you that. There is a certification fee, and then there is an annual membership fee, or an annual certification membership fee. And then there are varying lengths of the recertification, sort of how much time has to pass before you get to recertification. But after you've been a certified agent for a number of years, the period is 5 years. The process, real quick, agents will have to be submitted to a background check, which is incredibly thorough, and sometimes things have come up that have made us reject an agency for certification. The committee then needs to approve them for advancement, and then the next step is for the agent to self-study the certification standards. So they need to be intimately acquainted with these standards. We will then send somebody from the certification committee to the agency in their country, and the agency covers this cost as well. And they will be there for several days reviewing the agency on site. Once that review is complete, there will then be a call for comments from the public. So this is where anyone who's worked with that agent in the past has the opportunity to chime in and make any comments that they think would be relevant to the certification. And then finally, once all of that has moved on, the agency will undergo final approval by the certification committee. For the institutional memberships, which I highly recommend, not just as a board member, but also as someone who's been to the conferences for a number of years, it's a community network of international recruiters, essentially, at all levels. We have a lot of AVPs, we've got director level, and we've got the boots on the ground as well. It's an incredible forum for sharing best practices on international recruitment and agency recruitment as well. There is a reduced conference registration fee for members, and you, as a member, have access to our online library where you can find sample agreements for agency recruitment, manuals, best practice resources, white papers, and things like that. There's a monthly newsletter, and also there's a directory of all certified agents and members. Lastly, well, almost lastly, institutional member fees are, we've got two different categories. For institutions with less than 10,000 students, it's $600 a year. And for institutions with more than 10,000 students, it's $1,100 per year. And this is, again, per institution. It's not like other organizations where you're paying per person. So AIRC today we're now 7 years into this, and we just completed our annual conference in Miami where Ray and I were both present last week. It was the 7th annual conference. We have 270 institutional members in total, and we had about 300 individuals attending the conference. We have more than 70 certified agencies and 6 pathway members, as well as 10 affiliate institutional members. So I think I will leave it at that, and I'm more than happy to take any questions by email. They're channeled through NAGAP, so please feel free to get in touch if you have any other questions.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, we realized that was a lot of information in a very short period. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
No, yeah, no, that was a fantastic overview. I think that was all very helpful information. We certainly appreciate that. We do have a series of questions. I recognize that it is 10 past 2. I know our attendees might have other things to do, so please feel free to stay on. Maybe we'll answer questions for a couple of minutes here, and then any remaining questions we can maybe answer by email and send them all out to everybody with the slides. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Great.
So first question here is, what are the ethical considerations around the percentage an institution pays an agent? You touched on it a little bit, but are there caps, or is there a rule out, or do some schools just say, well, I'm going to pay as much as I can pay to make sure that agent gets me students over another school? Is there some sort of kind of guideline on that? You've touched on it, but
yeah, I think, I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that I get quite often because, you know, institutions are always asking, well, what are others doing? I think there's a couple of things to be considered. There are a number of markets where agents are working only on a commission basis, which, you know, for instance, IDP is one of the agents who work only with commission. And so the commission really is the source of income for the agent, who is, after all, trying to run a business. But at the same time, so my point with that was that you need to reach a certain level where it is actually worthwhile for the agent to work with you as an institution. At the same time, I would always be cautious about going too high as well, because for a variety of reasons. First of all, you don't want to make it so unreasonably high that it's perceived as you trying to bribe the agent or in any way really sway them to send you students just for money, as opposed to sending you students that fit your institution. Also, once you go that high for commission, it's incredibly hard to back down. I faced that, I realized that the hard way in coming into this position, because in the past we as an institution had I don't want to use the word throwing a lot of money at the students, but you know, there were a lot of high contracts with high commission rates, with bonus schemes where without necessarily knowing if the agent was going to perform, we had set that quite high. So then if the agent doesn't perform, it's quite hard to sort of pull that back down. So I would say, I mean, the typical range in the U.S. is anywhere from 10 to 15%, and that's just an estimate. But what it really comes down to is your ROI, and looking into, well, what are my tuition fees? How much does it cost for us to educate a student? And another thing to consider is if you are, I know that we have only graduate recruiters on the line, or graduate institutions on the line, but for instance, for community colleges who have a very low tuition fee, they can't just say, well, it's 10%, take it or leave it, because that's just not sustainable for an agent who works only for commission, because sometimes community college fees are $3,000 a year, or $4,000 or $5,000, which leaves the agent with a total of $500 for a student who maybe they work with for 6 months or a year. So as a guideline, as a rule, I would say 10 to 15%, but there's a lot of other things to be taken into consideration. So I would, again, try to ask around.
Okay, and this sounds like a fairly complicated question, but I'll see if I can try to simplify it. But what are the average costs for maintaining a relationship with an agent, including, you know, getting the contract signed, vetting them, due diligence training, providing assets, quality control, personal visits, those types of things?
Oh, I don't know that there is an answer to that question. I think it really depends on what you do with that relationship. I mean, there are inexpensive ways of doing it. There are expensive ways of doing it. You can travel more, you can travel less. The most important thing really is that you find tools to maintain the relationship while you're doing what you're doing, essentially. So if you have a limited budget, you might not be able to travel to the market. It becomes more important for you to be in touch with the agent on an ongoing basis, host a training webinar, which wouldn't be that expensive. You know, things that don't necessarily have a sort of a hard value to them. What you will mostly be investing, and what can be hard to measure, is staff resources. If you have an agent who's not responsive to training, who you have to keep telling them the same thing over and over, it ends up taking a lot of time from your staff members in the international admissions office or in your admissions office. So it really is a matter of finding the relationships that cost you the least, in terms of effort, in particular, and less about how many times you need to be in the market, because there are ways around it. It's always encouraged, but try to find the good relationships first, and then the cost is usually absorbed more by that, if that makes sense. It is a very complicated question and a great one, and but one that will sort of, that there's not a single answer to that, as you could probably guess from my rather long-winded response.
Okay, and there's a logistical question here that do agents typically receive, like, when a student is admitted,
Mm-hmm.
does the admission letter or email or even the I-20 go to the agent or go to the student or both?
It depends on the institution. There are some institutions who are not comfortable sending it only to the agent. As an agent, I will say the worst thing you can do is to send it only to the student, because agents their function in this process is to manage it, and students trust them to help them with the next step. If the agent doesn't know that it's time for the student to take the next step, that kind of sabotages the whole process. So if you feel the need to send it, if you would prefer to send it to the student, do so, but make sure that the agent is kept in the loop. I would recommend sending it to the agent. If you have an agent that you trust, there shouldn't be any reason not to do that, and then you know that it's being taken care of. If you send it to the student, they might not know what to do with it, and the process might be stalled. So either both or the agent.
Great, and I'll throw one more question to you guys, and then there's one that I think would take a significant amount of time that we can probably comment on, maybe separately in another venue, the email. But do you recommend any companies that manage agents from within the United States?
I know of them. I personally prefer to work directly with my agent, because there is an additional communication link. There are some U.S. institutions who are more comfortable working with a U.S. provider who then works with a network of agents. It sets very high requirements for that agent, the main agent in the U.S., to have a very good communication system and network. If that agent is not doing a very good communication job, then that becomes a problem, and essentially he or she becomes kind of the bottleneck. So it is a possibility. There are some institutions who do it. I prefer to work directly with agents. Ray, do you have any thoughts on that?
I was just going to suggest that if you're curious about who to work with and you're looking for folks within the United States to work with, that starting with the AIRC certified agents list is a good place to begin, because there are folks there that are U.S. based. But as Kirsten said, that in many cases they're dealing with what we would consider sub-agents, that they are a broker, if you will, between you and the agent. And in some cases you may be better off going directly to the source. But as I said, there are some AIC certified folks who do this, and they're probably among the best ones to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree.
Great. Oh, the question was, can you repeat the organization? But I think it was just AIRC that you mentioned, right, Ray?
Yes, AIRC, and on the bottom of the screen you see right now is the website for AIRC, where you can see a list of their certified agents and learn more about their certification process.
Perfect. All right. Well, I know that we're about 20 minutes past, and we've had 17 people that hung on past 2 o'clock. So appreciate all your time, everybody. And Ray and Kirsten, thank you so much for such a wealth of information. This was really in-depth and helpful. And we'll be posting this video on our YouTube channel, as I mentioned, just youtube.com/NAGAP video. And we'll send that link out to you as well as the slides later on. And if you have any follow-up questions, you have contact information for Kirsten and Ray here. And to the two of you, thank you so much for your time and all your information. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and have a great day. We hope to see you at a future event.